I'm David Lombardo, and this is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room. We're going to share an excerpt of an interview we recorded for the Capitol Press Room television broadcast with B. Hanson, Director of the State Office of Victim Services. Well, thanks so much for making the time, B. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
So I want to start with your interaction or relationship with the federal government. And there's been a lot of hostility from the Trump administration towards the undocumented population, transgender New Yorkers. And I'm curious whether that is impacting your ability right now or maybe prospectively to serve this population when they are in need of crime victim services.
Well, I think we're seeing fear in communities. We're seeing fear in undocumented communities and transgender communities about access to services. But the reality is, in New York State, we're continuing to serve undocumented people and transgender people and all New Yorkers who've been victims of any kind of crime and violence. So any of the work that the federal administration is doing has really had no impact on us and our ability to do our work. There was a lawsuit that New York started with a number of other states to challenge the federal administration's any kind of rollbacks or requirements around immigration, and the Department of Justice stopped moving forward in any of those areas because of that lawsuit. So we're able to serve undocumented people and transgender people like any other New Yorkers.
Are you worried, though, moving forward as sort of a pass-through agency for some federal dollars, that the money that you might get in the future will come with strings attached and says, you can't help this population, you can't help this population? And if they are passing some sort of rules and restrictions like that, what options are you left with?
Well, so far it hasn't happened. And so I think, we're very committed. Governor Hochul's very committed. She's talked over and over again about how this is a safe place for all New Yorkers, whether they're documented or not, and regardless of gender identity. And that's my commitment as well. And we have been able to challenge and successfully challenge anything that's come forward from the federal administration, and we will continue to do that.
Well, then let's talk about the demand for crime victim services and people actually coming forward to try to utilize them. Because in addition to what we're talking about at the federal level and the idea that maybe some people are going to be uncomfortable interacting with state government services or the nonprofits that you contract with, at the same time, the state has been trying to make it easier for people to seek crime victim services, creating other pathways so that maybe they don't necessarily have to go to law enforcement, for example, to get that process going. Are you seeing any demonstrable changes in the requests for crime victim services?
It's a little too early to tell. We had a law that passed that went into effect on December 31st of 25.
Sure.
And will allow victims to not have to go to law enforcement to ask for compensation and request those funds. So they can go to a victim assistance provider, they could go to a mental health provider or a doctor, a medical provider. We're anecdotally, I've been hearing from people that they're very, very excited about it. Some of the organizations that we fund that work in immigrant communities are very excited about the new law and have gone through a process so that they can certify that somebody was a victim of a crime. So I think we're going to see those upticks, but it's a little too early to tell.
Well, what, if anything, is being done to make people aware of the possibility of avoiding, say, law enforcement to file a crime victims claim?
Well, we're doing an ad campaign that's going to be coming out just in the next couple of weeks. That will be on all forms of social media, so Instagram and Facebook and LinkedIn. And so we hope people will follow and share those. We've been working with New York City, and we have information on the link kiosks in New York City about access to crime victim compensation. We have new brochures that we've been distributing. We've been working with our local victim assistance providers and district attorneys' offices and law enforcement to get the word out. So we're doing what we can do, and any way that folks can support that information and let people know that they can access resources, they can access services, counseling services, criminal justice services, compensation services without necessarily reporting to law enforcement.
So it's one thing to create more pathways for people to begin that process of seeking some sort of support. It's another thing to actually approve those claims. So why should people expect that this will be resulting in additional approvals? Because I could imagine some people might say, well, they're going to view this claim maybe with more scrutiny or maybe not take it as serious because I didn't go to law enforcement. What sort of mechanisms are in place so that you can properly vet and approve the people who go through these new ways of filing a claim?
Well, we're doing training with the victim assistance providers and the medical and mental health providers about how to certify a claim. And we're really going based on their certification and their expert opinion about whether this person was a victim of a crime. What we've had to do before that is double check with law enforcement, and law enforcement is super busy. So sometimes it's really hard to get a hold of them. So it could take months and months just to get a hold of a law enforcement officer to confirm that the crime actually happened. We don't have to do that anymore. So we can do that with those providers that are certifying it was a crime. So I think that's really we'll find that it's going to reduce the amount of time for that whole process to take place.
Well, sticking with the funding that's available, there's been increases to the caps on funeral and burial expenses that are allowed, as well as reimbursement for victims of financial scams. Are you finding that people are actually getting to enjoy or get to utilize these higher thresholds, or are the awards that are going out still kind of in keeping with the lower caps that have been in place before?
No, we're really seeing the higher caps being utilized already. Our funeral benefit cap went from $6,000 to $12,000. And another piece of that, in addition to the caps, because we know that funeral costs are really, really expensive. And the other piece of it is that we eliminated this concept of contributory conduct, where we would reduce awards if the person who was killed was involved in some kind of criminal activity. But we know that, it's often moms or grandmas that are paying for the funeral of their loved one. And if they were somehow involved in some sort of criminal activity or had a gun or something, sometimes those awards are getting reduced. That's not happening anymore. So we're fully paying out those awards. The other piece that's happened around scams and fraud is that the claims used to be only $100. That was all we could pay out. Now we can pay up to $2,500, which helps a lot. And one reason that it really helps is that we found in a conference I was just at in Buffalo on Monday, is that people who are victims of scam are using that $2,500 to retain an attorney, so then they can sue the person who scammed them. So I've seen a lot of anecdotal information that the caps are really, really beneficial to victims.
By making higher dollar amounts available, is that reducing the overall number of grants or support that you can make available? Is this a zero-sum game, or are you still able to help the same amount of people and with higher thresholds?
We can help the same amount of people with higher thresholds. The money coming for compensation comes from a separate pool than the funding that comes for funding victim service providers, and it comes from the federal government based on the last 3 years of use. So we're able to continue to increase funding for compensation, and don't see any real issue in being able to continue to do that work and really provide more funding so that victims aren't paying out-of-pocket expenses after they've been a victim of a crime.
Sticking with the idea of federal support, there is a lot of, at least rhetoric from the White House about the importance of crime victims and being tough on crime. What is that translated to in terms of dollar amounts that actually flow to states like New York for victim services?
I mean, I haven't seen any additional money coming from the White House for crime victims, and I wish there were. The funding that we get through the Office of Victim Services actually doesn't come from the White House. It doesn't come from taxpayer dollars. It comes from fines and fees. So it's federal prosecution of cases and fines and fees that are associated with that. It really funds the coffers for the Office of Victim Services and other state organizations that do similar kind of work. I think the fear is that in the last Trump administration, we know that they weren't prosecuting so many white-collar crimes, and that's where the bulk of the money comes from. And the fear is that's going to happen again, and so we'll see reductions in the federal coffers. What Governor Hochul has done for the past few years is make sure that the state will cover any kind of reduction in federal awards so that we're not seeing any overall reduction in funding to crime victim services.
Well, lastly, I want to come back to an issue that was kind of a problem last year, and that has to do with the funding for the victim services providers that you contract with. There were red flags raised with the procurement issue. The comptroller basically had you guys go back to square one, sort of, although people had been in the system, were able to get some of their past levels of funding. My understanding is that you're in the process of handing out some of that money again through an updated procurement process. Where do things stand with that? And has that resulted in any sort of meaningful setbacks for the providers that you contract with who might have been expecting higher levels of funding in that last go around?
Yeah, I mean, it was a disappointing thing for us, but we got through it, and we were able to extend the current grantees for another year. So I think with the RFA that they didn't get, some were going to get more, some were going to get less. So they ended up getting the same amount of money, so that there was some stability there for all of those organizations that we had funded. In addition, there were about 30 new programs that were slated to get funding. The governor added extra money to be able to fund those for a year as well. So I think we're in a good position coming into this new solicitation that came out, and we got all of the applicants just a few weeks ago, and are slated to move forward and work with the controller's office and get funding out to folks starting October 1st when the fiscal year starts.
And that was a big selling point of last year's procurement process, this idea that there were going to be more organizations brought into the fold. At the same time, though, I had heard from some organizations that were previously funded that they were going to see a drop in some of their funding. Have you responded or addressed that, given the additional time that you've had with this procurement process? Or is it the case that some of the providers who had been getting awards in the past might see declines in the future as part of this broader expansion?
Well, I think, the need is great. And I think the big issue is the Office of Victim Services or any one agency isn't going to meet everybody's need. And I think we've seen reductions in federal money directly to service providers through the Federal Office for Victims of Crime and Office on Violence Against Women. Those fundings have gone down, and I know Governor Hochul has talked about in many cases that when the federal money goes down, the state can't pick up everything. So I think we're going to do the best that we can to support programs. We really want to encourage counties and cities and private foundations to really provide support to the services that are critically needed to help victims of crime across the state.
Well, Bea, thank you for making the time, and thanks for the work you do.
Thank you. Thanks for letting me be here. It's great to see you.
And that was our conversation with Bea Hanson, Director for the State Office of Victim Services. Support for the Capitol Press Room comes from O'Donnell & Associates, a public affairs firm providing strategic guidance to businesses and nonprofits on navigating policy and regulatory issues. More information is available at o'donnellsolutions.com.